Hey, you're listening to the Wise Words Book Club, where we don't just read, we remember. And in this case, we take the best ideas from some of the best non-fiction books and teach you how to apply them to the real world. So, without further ado, let's listen to some wise words. So, a mind for numbers. I think we both, read this at the same time. It was one of our first books on learning. It basically describes the idea of like a lot of ways in which to learn and the best ways to learn. And it breaks it down. It's a very nice book to read, actually. It's very sort of simplistic. It's got the summaries of each chapter at the end of the chapters. And yeah, it's very sort of seamless and like well thought out. I think that's what kind of got me more interested in other areas and more like because it's quite sort of generalized, but it doesn't go into like the neuroscience behind all of it. But I think that's what sort of spurred me on to go and check out the rest.
Yeah, it was a catalyst for your interest, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Um, yeah, I think it was an interesting book in the sense that it offered very practical tips to learning, and I still find it obscene that at school we actually don't get taught how to learn because effectively we spend God, I'm gonna butcher this, but 13 years of our life maybe learning, but then we don't actually know how to learn, and we're kind of expected to be able to learn ourselves through, I guess, homework and other sort of mechanisms that they've created to sort of engage us. But in reality, that's just not how it really works. And I mean, at school, they did kind of offer these. Well, they kind of have it right in the sense that they understand that um, repeating a message again and again really helps sort of drill things home. But I think what school really sort of forgets is that if you don't really get the context of something you're trying to learn, or you don't understand the parts of something you're trying to learn, and let's say you get left behind it from an early stage, you are then essentially going to struggle with the rest of your schooling because if you don't understand the principles behind what you're trying to learn, everything must seem pretty confusing.
Absolutely. No, I couldn't agree more. It's nuts to think that you like you don't have a manual, to
No,
in how to think or how to
but we do now.
well, we do now.
Yeah.
They're all on it. But it's nuts that that you can approach something like, oh, memorize this, but you don't know how to memorize something yet. It's like,
Or it's not even just memorizing. I think it's more like how can you make something easier to remember.
yeah,
And I think this is what this book's main strong point was. It was like techniques for improving your ability to remember things
yeah,
and sort of almost best practices. Like at the end of the day, there's no like right or wrong answer to this. It's just more effective ways at remembering things better and trying to understand topics and concepts easier.
yeah. Well, I think it breaks it down into two parts, which are focus mode and diffuse mode. What did you take away from that?
So they differentiate between two types of thinking, which is focused and diffused. Focus is essentially, well, it's in the name, when you're focusing on yeah, as simple as that, on what you're doing. So you're almost in a sense of flow, and so that the challenge that you're facing or the work that you're doing has you completely encapsulated in it, and you're highly engaged. And that is useful for solving problems that maybe are just in your range, so not too far above your range in terms of what you can answer. And then there was diffuse thinking, which is essentially, in what I took away, was kind of like daydreaming, where you are not fully conscious or solving a problem or taking information, but your brain is churning that information over in the background. So, like, let's say you were learning maths, you would focus thinking would be like solving the actual problem in the classroom, maybe struggling with it or really sort of engaged with it, like because it's not easy. Whereas diffuse mode is sort of maybe if you didn't figure it out and you go sit back for a while and you're not really completely focusing on the problem, but then you think of an idea like, oh, maybe that's what the problem, how to solve that problem was. Maybe I didn't consider this, and that's the sort of diffuse mode. It's where your brain's making new connections. Whereas focused thinking was more where it's very sort of narrow. Um, but yeah, that's kind of what I took away from it.
I think, well, a lot of the diffuse mode, and I think everyone's probably had it, is when you're like walking around, you're not thinking about the topic at all, and then you suddenly have this like aha moment. It's like, oh shit, it's literally the light bulb on top of your head, like at the most
Hmm.
random times.
Eureka.
Yeah, exactly. And it's weird because I think it's like it depends on what sort of context you're in and whether your brain can sort of like substitute that into that context at that time and see if it works, and then it happens to like click.
When do you personally get it, mate? For me, it's really weird that it's driving.
Yeah,
Like, so this idea of diffused, right? Diffuse, sorry, thinking is where you are relatively distracted in something, but the thing that you're doing is very like monotonous and is almost on automatic behavior mode. So for me, I can drive without really thinking. I don't know if anybody else feels the same way, but you can literally drive a 20-minute journey and be like, what the hell was I doing that whole time? But for me, that's when my diffuse mode really kicks in, and my mind starts piecing together problems I didn't even know I kind of had. But yeah, for me, driving's actually the biggest one. Like, not even the shower is up there, even though people kind of the common theme is like, oh, you're in the shower and you think of a great idea. But I think the principle is you are slightly distracted with something, and then your brain's just the problem that you were thinking of earlier is still being solved, basically.
yeah. No, exactly. I think that's spot on. Like, I think probably mine is if I go for a walk or something like that, something that basically just takes my mind off the situation at hand, off the topic at hand, and then it allows me to have space. You know, it gives it's like because the focus is the narrowing and the diffuse is the wide. And when you're wide, it's like it can see a bunch of different like information that it could possibly use in its to its advantage. I think one thing I'd say about the focus mode is a lot of the time we look at a problem and we think we start applying like a solution to it and think that that's the only solution. And sometimes we get stuck in that sort of solution, and this is called the Einstellung effect, whereby you can't get out of seeing the only way of solving that problem. This is where the diffuse mode comes in super well because it kind of breaks away that only solution and gives you plenty more.
Yeah. So it basically breaks away from your current thought process. So like you have a process in your head for how to solve a problem, and when it doesn't work, no matter how hard you focus, that's not gonna help you solve the problem, because solving a problem which where your linear process doesn't work actually isn't going to help at all. So you need that sort of diffuse mode to actually consider other possibilities or other ways of solving the problem.
Yeah.
So I think that's why it's so important. It's the ability to realize that, right, okay, whatever I'm trying now is not working. Let's take some time. Let's take some space. Let's not just try and brute force a solution,
Mm.
and let's sort of widen the possibilities and then come back to it at a later stage. I'm not encouraging somebody to like walk away from a solution and spend like 5 days like on a massive bender, because that doesn't count as diffused
No.
thinking. But you do need some sort of space from the problem. I think that's kind of why a lot of problems or big sort of innovations in the past are always done by people who claim to have like been going for a walk or having a shower, because it's that time away from the problem which helps you find the solutions which aren't obvious.
Yeah. Like it's basically a way of optimizing, isn't it? It's like you want to have moderation between the two. You want to focus on something so that it's in your head, and then you can like go off and diffuse about it later on. But the best way of optimizing, when you're saying that it doesn't require as much time, as in you don't need to apply, you don't need to sit down for 3 hours at a time. She talks about the Pomodoro Technique,
Mm-hmm.
um, whereby you give yourself a kind of reward, as in like you sit down for about 25 minutes and then you can do whatever you want as like a kind of reward, but not for like you only do 25 minutes and then you go off for 3 hours. It's more you do 25 minutes and then you can have like 5 minutes like reward, that kind of thing.
I think that really plays into this idea of spaced repetition. So the
Mm.
idea that you're not um, just continuously, it's back to this diffuse mode as well. You're not just continuously trying to solve a problem. You're giving yourself enough time to break and your brain to rest.
Yeah.
If you spend hours in a row trying to figure things out and getting really disheartened with the results, you either one sort of give up with what you're trying to do, or two, you just don't actually learn anything because your brain's reached almost like full capacity. So it's good to space out your learning. I mean, the Pomodoro technique wasn't something I knew about, but I did remember from school there was the idea of revision breaks, and they did try and push in like revise for 45 minutes and then break for 15. But I think her main point was actually that's not as good. I think it was smaller bursts, so like little sprints. Think of it as 100-meter sprints rather than a marathon. It's it's like do 10-15 minutes at a time, a 2-minute break, 10-15 minutes, 2-minute break.
Yeah.
Um, And this idea of spaced repetition is you need to space out your tackling of the material. So it's not like you spend one whole day doing maths and then the next whole day doing geography. It's more like you do maybe an hour of maths today, an hour of maths tomorrow, an hour of maths the day after, because that repetition over the course of the days allows for transference of these memories into your longer term memory, which I thought was really interesting. I mean, it kind of makes sense that the more you repeat something over time, the more it becomes ingrained.
Yeah.
It's one of those things that you kind of take for granted, and we all think, "Oh, nah, it's all right, we'll be fine." And then, for example, even with books, mate, like we could read a book, and half the reason we're even doing this podcast is because it allows us to revisit books
Yeah.
and talk about them and learn them better. Um, because essentially, I've read a few books over the last couple of years, and if I had to think about some of the ones which I one didn't take notes for, two haven't read in 2-3 years, I actually really struggled to bring up even what that was about,
Yeah.
and that really for me just illustrates this idea that if you don't consistently revisit something with spaced repetition, you will forget it.
Yeah. Absolutely.
As simple as.
Yeah. You need to sort of um, internalize it, and internalizing does, like, if you think of your attention as like a set limit, as in, it rejuvenates, but something that if you focus 3 hours on something, your attention will drain drastically. Okay, hence why the small little bursts are like great, because it's like
Mhm.
I can apply all my attention quickly and then let it recuperate and then do it again. And
Sure.
like you're saying, doing different subjects, that makes it like more transferable to different areas, is
Mhm.
definitely, I think, a crucial thing.
Yeah, 100%. It's also this idea of doing more than one subject is also stimulates our brain's need for novelty. So if we continuously are repeating the same thing again and again and again, our brains will get bored and do. Um, and it's interesting because if we just keep revisiting the same problem or the same idea, we're not going to actually learn anything. I would almost argue the spaced repetition works best when, let's just say, you're doing biology and you're learning some key concepts. You move from concept to concept
Yeah.
to stop yourself from getting bored.
Yeah.
And don't sit too long with a concept. Maybe you don't understand it now, but then coming back later, after your brain's got a bit of diffused thinking about it, you might understand it a little bit better. And just chip away at it, like with a rock pick, right? You don't try and destroy a whole mountain in one go. Just chip away, and over time you'll be able to learn it better. Essentially.
Yeah. I think like a large a large part of that is this idea to use different methods or different contexts. It's like not everyone is going to figure out the same problem in the same exact way. And so if
Mhm.
you're chipping away at something, but you can't find a solution, it's like try and chip away at it in a different way.
I think this leads nicely into metaphors and analogies,
Yeah.
in the sense that if you can explain a complex concept or sort of mechanism, or the way something works in a way that people understand, the way I think of this is kind of like maths. When you're doing maths at a young age, they try and explain stuff in terms of like the quantities of apples you're buying.
Yeah.
They try and humanize what the numbers represent, and I think it's the same for kind for all subjects really. If you can explain something which is really highly complex in a way that somebody will understand in terms of human terms or something they're familiar with,
Yeah.
um, then you're going to really help somebody understand what they're trying to learn better, even if it isn't an 100% like accurate match to match of what you're describing the concept as. But it's really important for gaining confidence as well, which I think is really important for, because if, for example, if you're really struggling with something again and again and again, you come to believe that you can't actually figure something out, or you're never going to get it. But in reality, you just haven't tried looking at it from the right way for yourself.
Yeah.
Um,
Exactly. I think it's this idea of like contextualizing the problem. It's like, if you can make something make sense to you and in your language and in your sort of mental models, in the way you
mhm.
see the world, then it's much more easier to understand that information. At the end of the day, it's just information. Everyone just has different tools in which to understand.
I was thinking, mate, what metaphor I could use. So, for example, the way people sort of conceptualize the brain, right, is as a computer,
Yeah.
and this is the point of metaphors, right? So it's very useful to understand the brain as a computer in the sense that we can think of it as retrieving memories, and then spurting out memories, for example. But then also this metaphor fails us because a computer doesn't lose memory, etc. Right? So it's a useful analogy to sort of get somebody who doesn't understand what a brain is to understand it a little bit better. But at the same time, it's not complete, and there is ways it doesn't map. So basically, I think the way I think of metaphors and learning is you learn it through that through that concept, through that metaphor, and then once you start finding where that fails, you then have to find a new metaphor. So you're slowly moving up this metaphor ladder as well. And then you get to this point where you kind of understand it with all the nuances and you have your own sort of view of how it works. But you need to build up from the familiar. And that's kind of where I see it.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think no, I couldn't agree more. Actually, I think it's such a important way in which we like understand the world. Like
Hmm.
everything that we're looking at, every just day to day life, we translate that in our own way of understanding
Hmm.
something.
100%.
So the better you are at that, the more likely you will be able to translate information and understand it better.
Yeah, it's such an amazing way of thinking about, like, this is literally how we think about everything. So I would almost say if you're not understanding something, you need to just look at what metaphor you're using and then
Yeah,
try and change it.
yeah,
No, literally.
exactly. I think you picked up
uh,
on a good point where you said the concept of it, and it is like
yeah.
everything, the information or the main thing that you want from the information is this concept, and it's basically
Mhm.
just being able to substitute it into as many sort of areas as you can, see if it works out, and then if it does, then it's making that concept stronger.
I think it's really interesting as well. It's kind of go off on a tangent here, but like each discipline has a different metaphor for explaining something. So if you go into biology, we are essentially an animal. So our concept is always compared to, as a human, to other animals. So our actions and everything is compared in animalistic terms.
Mm,
Whereas if you go into physics, the concepts are around about energy and
yeah,
atoms, and therefore through their lens, humans are described in the sense of atoms, if you kind of get me.
yeah,
So every single different sort of discipline has their own metaphors and conceptions that they view the world through.
yeah,
It sounds really deep, but it's super interesting because maybe if you're not viewing it right this way, you could look at it from a different lens and understand things better.
yeah. No, I agree. I agree totally. The meaning is not static; it is changing, and it depends on what context it's in.
And yeah, I look at it as context, but I also look at it as lenses, like putting on a different pair of glasses. You're like, one minute you're viewing the world through as animals and biology and competition and natural selection. Next thing put your bloody chemistry lens on, you're looking at chemical reactions, right? You're looking at
Yeah,
atomic structure. Go through the physics lens. You're looking at energy. You're looking at movement. You're looking at force. Um, yeah, and yeah, I mean, there's many ways to look at the same thing. That's kind of my point. And
yeah,
if you can't understand something at the moment, it's because you're probably looking at it in a way which isn't familiar to you. You need to think of a better metaphor, something that could familiarize you with something, and you kind of get the rough idea of how something works without actually knowing the actual, like, the real details.
yeah.
Um, and that's what the best teachers do. They explain things in ways that you can latch onto and understand.
Well, yeah, because at the end of the day, it is this self-teaching like aspect to it, and she goes on about this bit in the book. It's like you want to be able to teach someone to self-learn and self-teach. Otherwise, it's like they're constantly at your mercy, and they're constantly looking for someone to say whether that's right or whether that's wrong. And to go through life like that is clearly not the most, you know, efficient way.
Yeah, you need to be your own problem solver almost. Like, all right, so I don't understand this now, just because. Like, I guess the argument is, oh, you still need to learn from somewhere, but you need to have more self-reliance almost. I think this is kind of what this whole book's about, sort of becoming a self-reliant learner.
Yeah,
um
she touches on a point where if you're approaching a problem, approach the hardest one first, because you have your most energy, your most attention, your attention bar is full, so to speak. And so what you want to do is like when it's at its strongest, attack that hardest problem to try and chip away and get to that concept. And then, if you're struggling, then diffuse, go and do something else, and then when you come back, maybe try a different angle. It's all ways in which like everyone has to figure out their own sort of recipe, their own approach uh, to learning something. And I think when you get that, when you like really hammer that down, then I think you're in a much more confident position to approach anything, really.
Sure. I think the insight here is, like, we all learn slightly differently, or we all have our own knowledge, which we need to connect this new stuff to. And the problem with teaching and school in general is because there tends to be information transmission, like they just give you the information, right? some people it clicks with. Some people they get it. They then go on to do really well. Some people it doesn't click with. It just doesn't fit into the way they see everything and the way they perceive the world, right? And then what happens over time is a big discrepancy between the people who succeed and the people who don't, and then they then become to label themselves in achievers and non-achievers type of thing. Or maybe I'm completely generalizing here, but what I'm saying is if you give everybody the same information and don't tell them how to or help them process it, what you're doing is you're inherently creating inequality because people see information in different ways and have different experiences to connect it to.
Yeah, or like just on the basic premise that we already like how many times is it emphasized to you that everyone's themselves, like everyone's an individual, yet we get taught in the same way as everyone else, which doesn't make sense. Like naturally, if you're an individual, like the fact that you are an individual and you're not like everyone else means that everything that is about you, your learning method and everything like that, is also going to be slightly different. Yes, there will obviously be resemblances and like similarities, but it doesn't mean that it's a god-given fact that everyone is exactly the same and learns exactly the same.
Sure, sure. And I think some people as well are more active in their sort of. So, like, let's just say you give a whole class a load of information about something. There's going to be some kids in there. I would put my money on these ones being the ones that do the best, who ask lots of questions and try and work out how that information fits into like a bigger picture.
Yeah,
And then there's other people in the class who basically see the information, obviously can't see the bigger picture, and they're not asking the questions to try and understand the bigger picture. If you kind of get me, they don't care about the bigger picture. They just kind of want to pass their class, or they just don't care about school, right? Because they've had a bad experience in the past. Um, and the problem is if you don't actually understand this bigger picture of where this learning or information actually fits, you're not going to be incentivized to try and figure out. You're just going to think, oh, I can't do this. They're talking a bunch of baloney. It doesn't mean anything to me, and I don't care about it because obviously, if it doesn't mean anything to me, why would I care? And then essentially, they're not going to be able to learn. So for me, this like kind of leans into this idea that she talks about bottom up and top down learning, and this is like for me, this was really really important. The more I think about it, the more important it is. So it's the idea that the top down learning is like the overall problem and context of what you're trying to solve, why this information matters, and the bottom up learning is the small bits that add up to the big context. Um, and it basically what happens a lot with school, and I think we've talked about this before, Tristan, is like they specifically like in maths they give you um the end problem. So they give you like the equation and they give you the graph and they just show you the end result. They don't tell you like how the parts add up to the end result and also why that problem matters and what it actually solves. They kind of just show you a load of numbers and be like, right, solve this, and this is the way you solve it. But they don't tell you why you should care and what the problem actually is. And without understanding what it is, you just why would you ever care?
but that's the thing. It's like so. There's this illusion that if you have the information and you've learnt the information, it doesn't mean you've understood it. Okay, so like people think that okay, I understand it because I know that 2 + 2 = 4. But why 2 + 2 = 4? That's understanding. And when you understand something, you're more likely to like it because it's like with anything. It's like you may you may not like classical music, but the more you listen to it, if suddenly you start to understand it and understand like its depth, for instance, you're much more likely to like it. And the same goes with like everything else. It's just that you need to be able to understand it, and so the better you are at this sort of self-learning kind of thing, the better you be able to understand.
The way I see understanding is kind of like a puzzle. If you understand something relatively well, it's like tackling a jigsaw puzzle with the majority it filled in, so it's fun to finish it off.
Mm,
But if you don't understand it at all, it's like starting from the beginning with all the different pieces and not having any structure to it. You kind of look at it and you go, "Crap! Like, what am I going to do now? What's the first step?" Right?
yeah.
But at least when you kind of understand something, it gives you the structure around how to answer questions, like future questions. So I think it's this level of like understanding helps you give you or and gives you confidence to tackling problems in that subject in the future. Whereas if you don't understand it, it's literally like looking at a load of jigsaw pieces, thinking, how do I fit this all together? Like this, I just don't know how to do it.
Absolutely. You may like know that 2 + 2 = 4, but the actual concept behind it, when you understand that, then you realize, well, what got them to the concept of 2 + 2 = 4? And so it's more transferable. It's you can see it in other areas, whereas the information isn't really transferable. It's that is its static point, but the concept is fluid.
Yeah, I think you're right in the sense that the good thing about when you're really young is when they do the maths like that, they do kind of give you real world examples. Like 2 + 2 = 4, you have 2 apples, somebody gives you 2 apples, how many apples do you have? So they make it relatively relevant. It's more when you go into this more abstract, obscure world of like calculus. This, I mean, we're specifically talking about maths now, but it's when you take that step up and you just think, wow, there's a load of letters, a load of plus and equal signs. What the hell does that mean?
Yeah,
And why should I care?
yeah,
And that's why most people don't. I think the people who enjoy and do the best out of maths are the ones who get it and think, wow, this is so interesting. Like solving real world problems using maths. Oh my god, this is great. Whereas most people just see it as just like alien language and they literally look at it and go, don't want to do that. Don't understand a thing about it. Don't see why I should care about it. Um, and this failure to care about it is why people. Because like, let's put it this way: if you cared about something, you'll do it. People care about things and they do them. For example, people love playing video games. They care about it. They'll do it. They do it out of their own accord. Nobody pays people to play video games. They do it because they enjoy it. And people could have that level. They could have that sort of experience with learning and maths and all this stuff if they actually knew why and if they knew how to do it and could see their progress. In
yeah,
my head,
yeah. Well, I think so. Barbara Oakley touches on a good point with the idea of abstraction and turning it into concrete ideas. And like we've touched on the idea of basically metaphors because metaphors are making something more tangible, more concrete. And that's basically what like formulas are. Formulas are just abstract, like
mm-hmm.
abstract concepts. So if
Mm-hmm.
you work backwards and you take that concept and you put it in something concrete, like a metaphor, it makes much more sense because you have other things to interpret it through. It's like you understand 2 + 2 = 4 because two oranges, an orange is tangible, and that is something you already understand.
You've shown them what the parts mean, and I think this is back to the bottom up v top down thinking. Like don't only show them the equation or the parts of what makes up the whole, but you show them what each part represents.
Yeah,
So like with the 2 + 2, you're going two oranges, two more oranges. Okay, that's very obvious. But the problem is when you get to like maths and algebra and other stuff, which is way more abstract, you're getting like x² + y² = whatever, yeah? And you forget to see that these are just letters that represent something. They could be oranges, for example, couldn't they? But it's like the inability to teach us that these things represent something. I mean, maybe they did. Maybe I wasn't listening. It's
yeah,
highly likely. Uh, but it's one of these things that once you miss out on that key insight that each one of these things represents something, or you miss out on piecing together like a coherent puzzle, um, you then really struggle in the future in terms
yeah,
of trying to understand something.
yeah,
I mean, the way I see it as well is if we really want to look at it, language as well is also really abstract. Like if you try and learn a foreign language, you see a whole page of it, you think, what the hell is that thing on about? Like what are they talking about?
yeah, yeah,
Just a
yeah.
load of scribbles. And it's the same thing, just over time we've become so accustomed to it. That, and like we need to take that approach to most things, like what does that symbolize? Like what does that represent? Instead of just looking at it for what it is, like the literal thing. Um,
It's the idea that like we need to be able to um, I don't know, like realize that things do get more complex, but that doesn't mean that there isn't an answer for them. It's like the,
sure.
the two oranges. Most people can relate to the two oranges, but when it gets like to much more complicated algebra, it's a bit hard to contextualize that for everyone and have like a reason for everyone. Maybe that's why I don't know. Maths was like, oh well, school was hard in terms of that. When it gets more complex,
Yeah, for sure. A levels was a big step up. I remember it
yeah,
being like, wow,
and being able to like contextualize for yourself, maybe that's where it comes in more prominent and becomes more prominent.
I'd say a really interesting thing that I've noticed about myself as well. For example, when I look at some of these books I have at the moment from George Lakoff, like the metaphor ones, and potentially the Language Instinct by Steven Pinker, which I haven't read any of them yet. But basically, what I find is when I open it and I see all these weird like tree diagrams of language,
Yeah,
I immediately look at it and go, "Fuck, that's alien." But I don't want. It puts me off the book, and that's just. I feel like that is probably what most people think when they see maths at school. They literally look at it. Their first thing is, "Wow, that is gibberish." It's kind of the same thing. Like if I pulled out like an Arabic newspaper, because they're not even like words to me or letters to me. I would literally be like, "No," like immediately, and that's kind of that impulsive reaction of it's not familiar. I don't like it. Bye. But how do you make something familiar, right? I think this is the key insight. It's like you figure out bit by bit and you piece it together. And then over time, through the spaced repetition, it grows. And
yeah.
then you suddenly gain insight into all of it, right?
Well, I think realistically, it's like when you are looking at these very daunting, equations or language or things like that, it's on the surface level. It's our fear that we think that we won't be able to understand it. And I think that's what halts a lot of our progress. It's because, oh no, I already know that I won't understand any of this. But realistically, you won't. As in, like, you will probably understand some of it. And there will be certain like relationships in which you will see if you actually start reading the book about language or something like that. And be like, oh, actually, that relates to something I already know. And it's like sort of diving underneath the surface and not taking the surface level as like a god-given thing that, like, judging a book by its cover. It's like if you see loads of mathematical equations on the book cover, it's going to be slightly daunting, but realistically it's the jumping in that will tell you whether it is hard or not, and then you can tackle it, whether from different angles or different methods. But you have to take that sort of jump. You have to take that leap to see whether or not. You can't make a prediction about that.
I think is also the idea of jumping in is a good one, but also at the same time is the idea of jumping in at kind of the right level.
Yeah,
Like, because the problem is if you jump in at the deep end, right, you're going to drown.
yeah,
Um,
exactly.
and it's the same with kind of some of this reading and stuff. Like, I purposely haven't read those metaphor books because I don't know enough about linguistics yet to even bother. So I kind of look at it and go, right, no, I need to sort of read maybe the basics first. But it's kind of that knowledge of knowing that although it might look hard now, over time it won't be if you sort of build up your knowledge piece by piece. It's back to that jigsaw puzzle analogy I was using. It's like if you start at the deep end, you have no structure to the jigsaw puzzle. You literally just see all the pieces in chaos. But as you start to learn maybe the principles behind a subject area, or you start to read the basics, you start getting the structure in the corners of the jigsaw, and then you start piecing it together, right? And that's kind of the way I sort of see it. Um, and it gives you the confidence as well, in terms of if you do the bottom up sort of learning where you learn the sort of how the things connect together and then what's the overall picture looking like why does it matter, what's the problem this is solving.
Well, she talks a lot about that in terms of like mental hooks, as in, like, you want these things that have associations. These, like, when you learn a concept, it has everything around it linked to it. And if you already have that association in your brain, it's just a hook. It's something that can relate to it and like sort of hold it up. If you learn something that's so static and so far out of your understanding, you're not going to remember it.
There's no hook, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting as well, just a note on this, that's a metaphor.
Yeah.
Like the mental hook itself, like your brain doesn't actually have a hook. But the whole concept of it, like, explains to you, right, that by creating a hook, you can then put your clothes on it, for example, or maybe like a clothes, like a mental clothesline, right? You're hooking something onto it, like it's something that supports something or catches something, which I think is really interesting. Um, but yeah, if you don't have that preliminary sort of information, or if you don't know why something matters, then you're less likely to remember it.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. It just makes more sense realistically. Like, you have to have so, some way in which to relate this information to something you've already experienced.
I think, for example, if you have an isolated word such as the, that means absolutely jack shit. But if you had like a sentence with a bit more context, then you have a hook to put some more information on.
Yeah.
Like by themselves, it doesn't make sense. The context created by multiple sort of pieces.
Hmm. I think that kind of leads into like the area of chunking.
Sure, yeah.
Do you wanna talk a bit about that?
So yeah, chunking is where you bring together separate bits of information to create specific meaning. Um, so the way I sort of look at it is you have individual words in a sentence, such as the, he, her, them, whatever, and chunking is essentially the whole sentence. And then what you would do is you'd break down that sentence into its meaning. So our brains continuously chunk all the time. Like we hear a sentence and then we chunk it down to what did that person mean or what does that sentence mean.
Yeah.
Um, it's kind of the way we will learn. It's basically why we categorize, right? So we categorize through stereotypes, etc. We categorize through labels, like he's a lazy person. That is essentially chunking in action. We have gone this information here. He acted lazy, and then we just then extrapolate and chunk him down as a lazy person, which actually is really unfair and irrational of us. If we could talk about this another time, but the idea of chunking is you take a big bit of information and you break it down to its core components, the most important, and it makes it more memorable, easier to remember, and it's easier to access. I was saying this to you the other day. I'm convinced that once we've got past the stage of learning a language where it's almost like intuitive, we actually think in chunks.
Yeah,
We don't think in terms of individual words. I don't think I don't think what I'm saying right now in individual terms. I just say it one big chunk. I have a point in my head. I then use language as the tool, but I chunk it down into sentences to then say it.
yeah.
But what did you get from chunking in general?
But I quite like to think of it kind of like a car. Like I know what wheels are. I know what an engine is. I know what a chair is and everything like that. And then I can put those pieces all together, and it creates like a car, like the idea of a car, the meaning of a car. And so
Mm.
it's those kind of like narrowing and widening, like we talked about at the beginning. It's you can dive into something like an engine. I know what an engine is. I don't actually know the different parts of an engine, but that would be like a chunk of an engine would be all of its little parts that build up to create it. But then you can also zoom out and be like, well, an engine is used in a car and in a truck and in a plane. And so it's it's having meaning that can call it sort of like, yeah, split into different levels and split, like, go down and like sort of you're focusing in, but then you can
Sure.
zoom out.
Yeah, I'm not going to go into what I would think, but I thought this idea is like you have separate chunks, right? Like what you're trying to say is you have a chunk of the general car, then you have like a more niche chunk of the wheel, and then you could niche down further into like what's the wheel's materials. And if you kind of the way I sort of see it is like expertise is basically refined chunking. It's like if you're an expert at something, you've basically broken the chunk down to like different parts, and you understand all the intricacies of the parts that make the whole.
Yeah,
This was kind of what
yeah.
expertise
But,
is.
I think they use, like, I've seen this example in so many different books, but the one of chess, and it's like when you're when you're a beginner, you have to learn the specific moves. Like a knight goes two spaces forward and then one to the right. And then bishops go on a diagonal, but it individually. Like this does this specific move. But when you understand all of that and you've categorized all of that in your brain, like masters just need to look at a board and they're not looking at, oh, okay, the bishop needs to go diagonal. They already know that. It's more they're looking on a different level now. You know
Looking at the patterns like, beyond it, right?
exactly. And it is a lot about the patterns, that you see.
Well, yeah. Well, essentially, as we just said, chunking is finding relevant, important patterns in information in what you're learning, and in using that as like a way of reminding yourself of how something works. It's like a mental model, really, isn't it? It's just chunking is a specific way something works, and you can refine your chunking depending on how intricate the details you want to go into, right?
yeah,
Um,
I've got a little like quote from her. Strong chunks form neural patterns that resonate not just in that specific subject, but in others as well, therefore giving us a different perspective.
I guess you could argue like the strong chunks could be the stuff which goes across disciplines. So, for
Mm,
example, like humans as animals and understanding the way that humans would behave in the terms of animals as a chunk, you could then apply it to economics. You could then apply it to sociology. You could apply it to interpersonal relationships.
yeah.
Um,
It kind of makes me think of this ad I saw a couple of years ago about the military, and it was saying if you know how to fix a bike, you know how to fix a car. If you know how to fix a car, you know how to fix a plane. And it kind of makes a lot of sense in terms of, like, obviously there's more to it than that, but if I know what an engine is and I know what a car is, and I know that an engine is also in a plane, then those already link. It's like you're zooming out, and then you've got more to like relate to in
yeah,
a broadening way. And then if I was to go into planes, then I could zoom in on the kind of like engine that would be incorporated in there. But it's kind of like you're constantly maneuvering around this sort of network, like you would say, through sort of chunks, through narrow widening.
well, they're familiar but different. If you kind of get
Yeah,
me, you roughly understand the way it works. Um, but then I guess you roughly understand how it works. You just add a bit more complexity. But by the time you already know how the old thing works, a bit more complexity probably doesn't phase you.
mm.
So you're like building piece by piece. You're not starting with the airplane engine. You're starting with a
Yeah,
bike,
yeah, exactly.
which makes a load of sense. Um, she also mentioned something about always focus on nailing the key ideas, and
Mm.
to me that is kind of what the chunky is. It's trying to boil down the maths problem, the concept in biology about how the cells interact, down to the key sort of process, the key idea. Um, and using the key idea to explain like sort of the relationships, if you kind of get me,
Yeah.
or you use the key idea to get a model in your head of how things work, and then you can add on all the details. So the key idea is the hook, and then you start placing all the things on the hook, like the names of the cells, for example, in biology. Like you don't start with the names of the cells without understanding the process, because if you do that, then there's nothing to hang it on. Which actually, now thinking about it, I never did in biology, which is kind of annoying. I always try to remember the bloody names first.
The amount of ways that I would have approached something that I was back at school,
Yeah.
I would think is so wrong now.
But I mean, this is probably slightly off topic, but yeah, how would you, now knowing this, let's just say you were given some maths homework or a maths question you didn't understand, how would you say you'd tackle it now?
Definitely just try to understand it first.
Okay.
There was a lot of this. Oh, you've done that. Move on to the next page. It's like, and then if you couldn't keep up, you were kind of drowning in this kind of work,
Mm-hmm.
like so many exercises. But that only got worse if you didn't understand how, like, the concept at the heart of it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, like, from reading this book, I definitely would spend more time just focusing on understanding the process at work first, and then being able to, like, apply it to different contexts. Otherwise,
Sure.
yeah, you sort of drown.
So you'd spend more time on the bottom up learning,
Yeah,
the building of the outside of the puzzle.
yeah,
Okay, yeah. I would also actually add, just from me and your personal experience with when we used to meet up and do maths, is we should have definitely done harder questions.
yeah,
I remember us having a massive tendency to put off doing anything we didn't understand. So we would just basically repeat all the ones we could do and be like, oh yeah, we're really good at
yeah,
maths.
yeah,
Like we can answer these questions, like ignoring 50% of the
yeah,
exam paper
yeah.
because we couldn't do those. And in reality, in my head as well, if you already understand something and you get it and you know how to do it, you should probably move on to something harder. Otherwise, you're not developing. It's
Well,
just
that, like you said, tackle the hard problems first, because realistically, what you're doing is, once you understand the concept and then you test it in harder conditions, it's like progressive overload.
mm,
It's you're strengthening that concept constantly, but you're not strengthening it if you're doing the same things
yeah.
you already know.
It's like going to the gym and only doing 20 press ups every day. I mean, obviously, in the long run, it might build up some level of functional fitness, but if you don't go 20, 25, 30,
Yeah,
35, 40, how are you going to get progress in
yeah.
my head? Eventually, you'll stall. So, yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
I think I think that ties quite well into her idea of the process and product, and
Okay.
how, like, another way to put it is like systems and goals, or so many people say it in different terminology, but the idea is that, you should focus on the process. The goal should be there that you can see, but it should not be the main focus, because,
Give us an example, mate.
sorry.
Give an example. Just to,
Like running a marathon, okay?
Mhm.
Like, it's rooted in fitness. You want to run a marathon, and that's the main thing. But the problem is, if you're only goal orientated, then when you run that marathon, you're just going to stop everything. Is it like,
Mhm.
what are you supposed to do now? The process needs to be that I'm going to the gym, I'm running a lot, I'm doing a lot of kind of fitness, and you need to focus on that and apply this progressive overload.
Mhm.
She talks about habits quite a lot,
Yeah.
and habits are a great thing because they loosen up these kind of areas in our brain where we, like, only have certain amount of information that we can think about.
Mhm.
So, like, she talks about, like, pockets, so, you I think it's 7 plus minus 2. So, you can only focus on, like, seven things at once, kind of. And the idea is that you want to automate a lot of that information so that you can free up one of those pockets in your mind. And habits are perfect at this. The problem is that when habits become automated, a lot of the time we don't question them, or we don't see if we're, like, really still improving. It's more about, oh, I've just done my habit. That's the goal. But the goal needs to be the process. You need to focus on whether you are improving and then apply this progressive overload to it. That way you get to your goal, and then you can surpass that and get to more goals, but keeping it consistent.
I think my version of that in terms of in the information space would be when she talks about learning to focus on the processes and not the product, she kind of means like we always tend to think about, oh, let's achieve, or the goal is, or the product is getting an 80% in a mouse test. But that isn't really how you're going to get there, if you kind of get me. She talks about making small manageable steps towards it. So the process would be dealing with one hard maths problem a day for 30 days. She talks more about breaking down your goal into steps that you can measure, and that you basically you focus on the process rather than the results, because the results take care of themselves once you've got the process down. And that's kind of what you meant with the marathon, right? It's
Yeah.
like you focus on the running each day, and that will get you your marathon
Yeah.
running.
Yeah.
And then also the thing I thought was interesting what you just said is like, are we really, I think what the problem mainly with education is we're so focused on this process, or sorry, the product of getting a percentage in a grade, that once we finish that, we then don't realize that learning never stops.
Yeah.
So if you fall in love with the process of continuously challenging yourself and doing harder problems, whether it be in biology, maths, engineering, physics, by getting progressively harder and harder, you are, I mean, I guess there isn't really an end product, but you're going to become more valuable, or you're going to become better at something. And you can only achieve that by focusing on the process, not the product.
Yeah.
And I think that was her main point.
I think you learn to take value from the process itself.
Mm-hmm.
It's like if you do acquire this, like, love for learning certain things, then you don't need that massive sort of goal to only give you value, or to only give you like a reward. You're constantly getting that reward by doing the system of learning. Um, yeah.
We've kind of, I think my personal main takeaways were like, what are basically, so you need to make sure you space your learning. It's not all about cramming it in one day. I mean, to be honest, this is relatively common knowledge, but the idea of short, sharp bursts of learning something, I think the idea of problem diagnosis and trying to understand something before you actually answer it, or as you're answering it, you're trying to build up this understanding of why it works that way, if you get me. So back to your fully understanding something, so the puzzle is kind of set, and therefore you can pick the pieces and fit it all together. What else? Yeah, so the idea of bottom-up learning, similar to that, essentially the same thing, really. It's understanding how the parts fit into the big picture, and also understanding why the big picture matters. Then chunking, which is basically breaking things down to the absolute principles, and understanding that this chunk, and the best chunks, sorry, as she said, were you're able to use them in other scenarios.
Yeah.
So there's such a powerful mental model, such a powerful way of seeing something that they can apply to different disciplines. So yeah, that would be mine. What about yours?
I echo that. I think just one of the main areas that I got away from this is just this concept sort of substitution, as in taking a concept from somewhere and applying it to a different context, applying it to a different problem, seeing if it works out. If it doesn't, find another type of context to put it into, and that way you really work on that problem solving solution.
Sure.
And I think,
You just described the essence of creativity.
yeah,
Combining things which essentially haven't been combined before. So taking a concept and combining it somewhere maybe somebody else hasn't thought of.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, I'd say all of those are very crucial points in which to learn better.
It's a shame we learnt all of this at after I've left the university, after I've left school.
Well, it's never too late.
Yeah, it's never too late. So there you go.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that, guys. If you'd like to check out our book summary, head on over to our website, wisewords.blog. And if you feel like being inspired throughout the week with some little nuggets of wisdom, go and follow us on Instagram at wisewordssummons. Until next time, guys, have a good one.